I'm going to talk about the biggest disruption of the year 2016-17, which is the sudden uh, upsurge of populism in the United States, in Britain, in other parts of Europe, which was, I think, unanticipated by me, by virtually every other political observer, and talk about it a little bit in a comparative perspective. And then I'm actually going to say something about your country, Argentina. I've actually been going to Argentina for the last 25 years. My first visit was in the early 1990s. I met President Menem at that time, at the beginning, of this neoliberal period in your country's history. But we've been going back, or I've been going back pretty regularly. And I find Argentina one of the most interesting countries for reasons that I will get into, but particularly in this context because, in a sense, you pioneered a certain form of populism which now seems to be taking root here in the United States. So let me let me talk about this a little bit. There is a populist revolution that's going on in different parts of the world. With the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom last summer, and then with Trump's election in November, we seem to have dodged a bullet, so to speak, in the Netherlands on Wednesday because Geert Wilders and his Freedom Party did not do as well as he was expected to. But we've got a big election coming up this spring in France with Marine Le Pen and the National Front as at the moment, the leading candidate in the French election, which, if she succeeds actually in becoming president of France, will spell really, really major changes and perhaps even will mark the death of the European Union. And so all of this is going on in the most developed democratic parts of the world. It's something that your region, Latin America, has actually experienced ahead of us. And in some ways, the cycles in global history they're turning at slightly different rates. And I think that Latin America went through this populist phase. It began 10 or 15 years ago with the rise of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And fortunately, I think you are coming out of that period now, just at the moment that other parts of the world, the developed parts of the world, are going in. And so I think that it might actually be a point in time in which Latin America and Argentina in particular can actually provide some lessons to the United States. Usually, Americans are very arrogant and they love to lecture everybody about, the quality of their own country and their economy and their political system. We have a project in my center on American democracy in comparative perspective because it does seem to me that American institutions are really not perfect, much as Americans think they are, and that we can, one of the reform issues that we have in front of us is figuring out ways in which to fix them so as not to create the kinds of dysfunctions that we have seen. All right, let me begin by just discussing what populism is, because there's a number of definitions of it out there that I think we need to clarify, because the term is used very loosely to describe a lot of political movements that actually don't have a lot in common. Now, obviously, populism is related to popular sentiment and to democracy. One of the conventional understandings is that populism is a response to popular demands that are not sustainable. That is to say, populism satisfies popular passions in the short run, but produces policies that are not sustainable fiscally sustainable or politically sustainable in the longer run. That's one way of thinking about it. A second is that populism is fundamentally anti-elite. It begins with really a conspiratorial view of the world, that politics is controlled by elites that are operating outside of the glare of publicity of the media, that they are serving their own interests while pretending to serve the interests of a democratic public more generally, and it leads to a revolutionary demand to replace those elites with a different set of political actors. And indeed, those elites are usually not seen as necessarily domestic. They're linked to foreigners, to foreign conspiracies, to a lot of shadowy forces, which in an age of globalization seem very plausible to people, because in fact things going on in thousands of miles away elsewhere in the global economy can have really major impacts at home. The final definition, I think, has more to do with the political style of populism. So it attacks the existing elites and it attacks the existing institutional structure of a society, but the attack is led by someone around whom a cult of personality is built. And this is the area where I think, it occurred to many of us that Donald Trump was a really dangerous leader. Back last summer, actually, we were sitting here in this room watching the Republican National Convention when he was nominated to be the Republican candidate, and he gave an acceptance speech. And in that course of that speech, he said, first of all, everything in the United States is horrible. Crime is up. Nobody's got a job. Things have never been as bad in the last couple of generations. And then he said at the end, I alone can fix this. I alone can fix this. That is to say, American democracy cannot fix it. The Republican Party cannot fix it. You citizens cannot fix it. I alone, I, your leader, am necessary to fix it. And I think that, virtually every serious populist movement in history has been built around this anti-institutionalism. That is to say, this belief that the discretionary ability of a single strong individual was necessary to overcome whatever problems existed in the society. And that, I think, is the general tenor of populist politics. And what is going on in the world more broadly is, I would say, that the liberal part of liberal democracy is rising up and attacking the institutional, the democratic part of liberal democracy is rising up and attacking the liberal part. So, as I'm sure you are aware, liberal democracies are a complex combination of institutions. So, on the one hand, you have the liberal part, which has to do with law. It has to do with the rule of law, the existence of transparent rules by which power is limited in a democratic political system. And that is joined to a democratic part that operates by elections and tries to reflect the popular will. There's also an important third aspect, institutional aspect, which is the state, which is the institution that actually accumulates and uses power, and in a modern state uses that power on an impersonal basis. And I think what's characteristic of populism in general, and what has been going on in many parts of the world, is that democratic part is creating a certain pressure and a legitimacy that is directly eroding both the rule of law and the impersonal state. I think that is what happened over the last decade in Argentina, and I think that's the challenge that we face here in the United States, where you have a president who was actually not elected by a Democratic majority, as you're probably aware. In the popular vote, actually Hillary Clinton got about 2.8 million more votes than Donald Trump did, but he certainly won in the Electoral College. And that gives him the ability to use that mandate, and he's constantly referring to the people as giving him the authority and the legitimacy to carry out his agenda. And what that agenda has consisted of is actually, in many cases, trying to undermine institutions, American institutions, that get in his way, essentially. And so I remember this began actually over last summer with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You may not know the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's part of the Labor Department. It determines the unemployment rate. And right now they say the American unemployment rate is 4.7%. So Donald Trump began to say, no, I don't think that's right. I think that this institution is actually a partisan institution. The real unemployment rate is closer to 40%. And this institution has been corrupted as a result of partisan politics. And he's gone on to make similar charges against the intelligence community, against the Federal Reserve Board, most recently against the entire mainstream media. Now, for you Argentines, does that sound familiar, attacking a statistical agency in the name of, partisan politics? So I think that there's a actual logic to the way that, populism empowers individual leaders to try to displace institutions with their own judgment. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit of American history, because this is not the first time the United States has faced this kind of populism. It actually has a long history in the United States, and in certain ways the U.S. invented populism. Last week, Donald Trump went to Tennessee. He had a big rally there, and he visited the homestead. This is the home of President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828. He was the first populist president of the United States. He ran against a fellow named John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was an American elite. He went to Harvard University. His father was John Adams, the second president of the United States. He was educated in Europe. He traveled. He spoke European languages. Andrew Jackson, by contrast, was a frontiersman. He didn't have even a high school education. He was a fighter, an Indian fighter, a military hero in the War of 1812. And he was elected because at that point the United States opened up the franchise to all white males, so that for the first time in American history, basically all white males could vote in a presidential election. And he was elected on this wave of resentment against these Harvard-educated, Harvard-Yale-educated elites that constituted the founding generation of American democracy. And once he was elected, he said two things. He said, I am president of the United States. I can choose who runs the government. And secondly, it doesn't take a brilliant, educated person to run the government. Almost anybody can do this. And he is the one who inaugurated a century of what would be known in American history as the spoil system, or the patronage system, in which virtually every elected office in the United States, every bureaucratic office in the United States was appointed by a politician as a political payoff in return for some political debt. There is no professionalism in American public service. There is no regular bureaucracy. The bureaucracy would change entirely all the way down to your local post office every time a new party came into power. And the system was highly corrupt. This was a period in which there were major scandals in New York, in Chicago, in Boston, in virtually every major American city, which was run by a political machine. And in a sense, that, I think, has always been the challenge of populism, that it is a very crude expression of public will that does not like institutional constraints, and therefore, in American history, in the 19th century, eroded the possibility of having a modern, efficient, clean, uncorrupt American state. It took about 100 years for the United States to actually replace that system with a more modern bureaucratic one. And it's very interesting that Trump has picked this as his model. This is the one president whose example he wants to follow, because he believes that he is leading an American revolution against that. Like Andrew Jackson, he is very much a nationalist. His slogan has been America First. This applies both in the economy and in politics. So in the economy, it was interesting. He sent Steve Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary, to the G20 meeting just in this past week, and Mnuchin completely refused to sign off on a statement criticizing protectionism, which is a remarkable shift in American economic policy. In my lifetime, we've not seen a similar administration that is not willing to disavow protectionism or argue in favor of open trade. And the nationalism, I think, becomes a very powerful mobilizational tool. Again, like many populist leaders, Trump held a number of rallies as he was seeking the Republican nomination, and his supporters are extremely passionate. Now, I guess the bottom line of my story about comparative populisms and the rooting of this in American history is a little bit more complicated simply than to say that this is an unpleasant and potentially chauvinistic form of nationalism, because populism also represents something that is fundamentally democratic and legitimate, and also represents social grievances that are legitimate. And I think that in thinking about how to deal with populism, if you don't accept the legitimacy of some of the social forces that are driving the anger that leads people to elect populist leaders, you're not going to deal with the underlying phenomenon. I'll say a little bit more about this in the panel tomorrow afternoon about the social basis of this, but just in the briefest terms, we've had this long period of increasing liberal integration of the global economy led by the United States since the end of World War II. It's worked very well. Global output quadrupled between 1970 and 2008, the big crisis in the United States in 2008. So people have indeed gotten richer, but not everybody has shared in that wealth. And in particular, in the developed world, the working class, people that actually make things in manufacturing industries, have seen a dramatic decline in their real incomes, collapse of their communities, a lot of social ills like drug abuse and broken families and the like. And this is a group that has not been well represented, whom the elites have been able to largely ignore. And so populism ultimately lies in an underlying phenomenon of inequality. And you can bemoan the institutional attacks that result from this kind of anger from populist politicians, and you can worry about the future of liberal democracy with this kind of politics. But I think you have to recognize the fact that it is driven by an underlying social complaint that is real and that is legitimate. And if a democratic society does not deal with it, it's not going to deal. The populism isn't going to go away. So this lets me now switch over to Latin America and to your country in particular, because I think that there's a similar analysis for your region at all, and of course it does lie in the underlying phenomenon of inequality. As you're well aware, Latin America, of all the regions in the world, is the most unequal in terms of income, the distribution of income and wealth. That's gotten better in the last decade. So, congratulations for those countries that have succeeded in pushing back. But even so, the levels are very high. In Argentina, it seems to me that kind of inequality has a number of very complex and deep roots. And I don't think that the roots date only back to the 1970s. I think it goes much further than that. I think if you go back to, for example, the Rosas dictatorship in Buenos Aires in the 19th century, it's very interesting. In almost the exact same decade that the United States the Congress passed the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was an act that gave 40 acres to any American that was willing to go settle out in the West. And so it was a kind of land reform that headed off the creation of large landed estates, large haciendas. at the almost the same decade that the Homestead Act was being enacted in the United States, leaders like Rosas were actually concentrating land and putting into the hands of a very small number of families. And so you had a country, your country, that in many ways was, as Tullio Halpern has said, it was a country that was born liberal. It was settled by Europeans who didn't come with a lot of the class baggage from Europe, just like settlers to North America, but somehow they established a social hierarchy that then proceeded. And I think in later stages of Argentine history, individual leaders just made very bad choices, particularly with respect to the respect for institutions. So again, I know people blame, at different points, different moments in Argentine history. There's one that seems to me particularly important, which was the coup in 1930. I mean, the coup in 1930 is really the one that that led to this series of military governments. But in a way, the worst part of the coup was what happened after the coup, the fact that the Argentine Supreme Court retroactively said that it was constitutional, when it seems to me it was manifestly not constitutional. And that's the moment at which, this one powerful legal institution became corrupted, and it became the practice of subsequent Argentine presidents, to pack the court, to make sure that it would be a relatively pliant tool that would serve presidential power rather than acting as a fundamental brake on it. In that same decade, in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt in the United States tried to do the same thing. He had a very conservative Supreme Court that was getting in the way of a lot of his New Deal policies. He didn't like it, and so he said, well, the Constitution doesn't say we have to have 9 justices, and so he tried to appoint a series of more left-wing justices to balance out the court. And this is the moment, I think, at which basic respect for institutions becomes very important. At that point, both Republicans and Democrats said, you can't do that. The court is an independent institution. It has its own integrity. If it is telling the president you cannot do something, you have to respect that. You have to respect that. And Roosevelt, as a result of that political pressure, ultimately the pressure, in favor of an independent court backed off. And that is the kind of, so that's what it means to have institutions. That's what it means. I mean, ultimately, an institution isn't just a group of people sitting in a building. An institution is a set of beliefs in the population that you have to respect. You have to respect rules. You have to respect certain accepted ways of doing things, and that when those rules get in the way of you as a political leader, you have to respect them and observe those constraints. And if you don't, your military is not going to support you, your Congress is not going to support you, your courts are not going to support you, and ultimately people are going to be out on the streets protesting because you violated those rules, because you have fundamentally tried to undermine the rule of law. Now, I think that Argentina is still, unfortunately, living with a lot of that legacy, that a lot of your politics remains, I think, excessively bound up in personalities rather than in institutions and, coherent political parties that are promoting, consistent agendas that people can vote for. And I think that this has all been very detrimental to economic development, because in economics, people like regularity. People that invest large amounts of money want to know that they're going to be able to get it out, and therefore the respect for the rule of law, respect for basic property rights has been very critical. And because it's been such a bumpy ride, as the slide that Alan showed earlier indicated, I think it's been a very large deterrent to economic growth. So I guess my bottom line, I've been speaking to audiences in Latin America for some time. So remember, I said that there's these 3 basic institutions. You have the state, a modern impersonal state. you have the rule of law, and you have democracy. Those are the three pillars of a modern political order. In the previous generation, the big fight was over that democratic pillar because of all of the military dictatorships that occurred across Latin America. It was a huge and important struggle to get the military out of politics, to return politics to civilian control, and to respect the results of elections. I think that actually Latin America is one of the most successful regions in that respect. It's one of the most democratic. That battle, I think, has largely been won. You still have, people like Maduro in Venezuela. I mean, you've still got Cuba, although those places are in such bad shape that it's hard to imagine you're not going to have important changes there. But I think that democracy has been impressively consolidated, including in Argentina. So in the midst of your big crisis in 2000, 2001, the military, there's no hint that the military would come back to power. So that part is consolidated. The part that really needs work right now are the other two legs. The creation of a modern impersonal state, not one that is politicized through patronage appointments, one in which people are promoted on the basis of their expertise and technical ability and merit rather than politics, and the rule of law, the respect for judicial independence, for the law as something sacred in itself that needs to be respected by all political leaders. This is an area, so I know there's a big rivalry between Brazil and Argentina in a number of domains, but this is actually an area in which I think Brazil has been quite remarkable in the last 2 or 3 years. The one thing that they've got that almost no other country in Latin America has is an independent judiciary, as we've been witnessing with this, growing Odebrecht scandal that seems to be enveloping a great deal of the entire region. All right, so this is the agenda. Court system. You need, a much more independent and apolitical judiciary. In terms of federalism, I think there's a big agenda there because the way that revenues, and this is actually Alberto, his first book was on actually Mexican federalism and federalism in the region more broadly. But this is another area of institutions in which there's too much discretion given to the central government rather than clear rules about how revenues are to be distributed, which has historical roots, but I think has created big problems. And then finally, in terms of poverty, as I said, populism it's not something that comes from Mars. It's not an alien ship that lands and all of a sudden these populist politicians walk out of the spaceship and say, I'm your leader, please follow me. You have to have the underlying discontent in order to give them an audience. And without further efforts to reduce levels of poverty and to deal with economic insecurity in terms of a middle class that doesn't see much of a future in terms of employment and so forth, you're going to have populist leaders as long as that's the case. Now, I'm saying all of this about Argentina, not saying that as an American we've got all this right, we know how to take care of these problems. We are facing in many respects exactly that same set of issues. Our court system is actually being challenged as we speak, by the executive branch in the United States. We've got, big problems in allocation of responsibility to states in the United States because our federalism classically has been a way of, in a sense, protecting racial hierarchy. That was really the meaning of states' rights in the United States. And then finally, we've done a terrible job with poverty. Not just marginalized people like African Americans and recent immigrants, but also the working class. We've not taken care of them. We don't have a social safety net. I think that's been really good. That's done a good job in protecting them. And I would say that the United States is not going to be able to successfully deal with this populist disruption unless it fixes all of these problems. And then finally, I guess one last thing to say is about immigration, which is probably in cultural terms, the biggest disruption that is felt in the lives of a lot of ordinary Americans. 15% of the U.S. population today was born outside of the United States. Now, Argentina had a similar degree of, migration in earlier periods of its history. The United States did this at the turn of the 20th century. In 1924, that was cut off. It was cut off for a whole generation. The doors were opened again in the 1960s, and frankly, it's produced, a tremendous backlash. Communities have seen, themselves fill up with people that speak different languages, that have very different customs, and I think that disorientation is one of the issues that our politicians are going to have to deal with if you're going to get at the roots of what's driving this populism. So